Okay, so I just went over the mechanism of aldosterone action. Now I want to talk about the regulation of aldosterone secretion, or more specifically, what the stimuli are for aldosterone secretion. So here in this slide, you can see a couple of the stimuli for aldosterone secretion right here. So high potassium is going to stimulate aldosterone secretion. And very high osmolarity is going to inhibit aldosterone secretion. Okay, so what I'd like you to do right now is take a moment, hit pause if you need to, and think about why this makes sense, basically. Why would you want these responses from these stimuli? So yeah, go ahead and pause, think about it till it makes sense to you, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so hopefully you were able to make sense of this. So if you have high potassium, you are going to want to stimulate aldosterone secretion because aldosterone is going to lead to potassium secretion. You're going to be able to get rid of that potassium from your body, which is what you want to do if you have high potassium in your body. Secondly, if you have very high osmolarity in your body, you're going to want to stop aldosterone secretion because aldosterone is going to stimulate the reabsorption of sodium. And you don't want to be reabsorbing sodium if you already have a high osmolarity, because reabsorbing sodium is then going to increase your osmolarity even more. Okay. So those are two of the stimuli for aldosterone secretion, but I now want to mention another main stimulus for aldosterone secretion, which is basically there is this integrated pathway that we have for regulating osmolarity and blood pressure in our bodies, and aldosterone is part of that pathway. So let's take a look at that pathway. Okay, so here you can see um, that pathway. It's called the RAS pathway, acting as a stimulator, a stimulus for aldosterone secretion. Okay, and the RAS pathway is basically a pathway that gets activated when blood pressure is low. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that pathway. It's pretty complicated. Okay, so first of all, the RAS pathway, RAS stands for renin-angiotensin system. And actually, usually, if you look at other sources that are not your textbook, it's actually described with another A here. So that A stands for aldosterone. Okay. So what happens in the RAS pathway is that in response to low blood pressure, we have these cells in the afferent arterioles in our kidneys. They're called granular cells. Those granular cells are going to directly sense low blood pressure. They're also going to indirectly sense low blood pressure. Don't worry about the details of how they indirectly sense low blood pressure, but they do. Okay. And then in response to that low blood pressure, they're going to secrete an enzyme called renin. Okay. What does renin do? That is described in the next slide. Okay, so before I talk about what renin does, I need to describe to you this kind of situation in our bloodstream. We have in our bloodstream, we always have this protein called angiotensinogen. It's always floating around in the plasma. Angiotensinogen is made by the liver. Okay. When we secrete renin, renin can then act on angiotensinogen. It's going to activate it and turn it into this molecule called angiotensin 1. Okay. Angiotensin 1, in turn, is acted on by an enzyme that is located in our blood vessel endothelium. This enzyme is called ACE. ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. Okay. And as you might guess from the name, it is going to convert angiotensin 1 into another molecule called angiotensin 2. Okay, so you might need to pause and take a moment to review this if you would like. But basically, again, renin is going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. ACE is going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Okay, so now let's take a look at the action of angiotensin 2. Basically, angiotensin 2 is going to have a variety of effects in the body that are going to work together to bring blood pressure back up. Remember that this is a pathway that we are activating in response to low blood pressure. So we're going to try to bring blood pressure back up. Okay, these are our targets of angiotensin 2: the arterioles, the cardiovascular control center in the medulla, the hypothalamus, the adrenal cortex, and the proximal tubule of the kidney, of the nephron. Okay, what I'd like you to do at this point is, not quite yet, but hit pause when I tell you to, and think about what kinds of responses you would want from each of these targets that would then bring blood pressure back up. Okay, a little hint, a couple of these are a little hard to figure out, so don't worry if you can't figure them all out. But at the hypothalamus and the adrenal cortex, you want to think about what hormones are going to be secreted at those targets and what the action of those hormones are going to be. Okay, so go ahead. Now is the time. Hit pause and think about what those effects are going to be. Okay, hopefully you were able to figure out some of them. It might be hard to figure out all of them, but let's go over them now. So again, I want to remind you that this is a response to low blood pressure. We are going to want to act on all of these targets in such a way as to bring our blood pressure back up. Let's take a look at what we do. So the arterioles, we are going to want to vasoconstrict at our arterioles to bring blood pressure back up. Hopefully that makes sense to you. At our cardiovascular control center, basically what we're going to do is we're going to increase our cardiovascular response. What does that mean? It means all of those things that we talked about before, where we are increasing venous return, we're increasing our contractility, we're increasing our heart rate, and we are increasing our peripheral resistance by constricting our arterioles. Okay. At the hypothalamus, we are going to secrete vasopressin, which then is going to help us to reabsorb water. And in that way, that's going to bring our blood pressure back up. In addition, I don't expect you to have come up with this, but stimulation of the hypothalamus is also going to increase our thirst. Okay. Moving on, at the adrenal cortex, we are going to stimulate aldosterone secretion. So remember that we started this discussion by talking about aldosterone. And then finally, we are going to act directly on the proximal tubule here. We're going to act directly on the proximal tubule here to increase sodium reabsorption, which is one of the effects that we get from our aldosterone secretion as well. I just want to mention right here, there are some stars in this figure. You can ignore them. They had to do with like a question in the book. Yeah, so don't worry about them. Okay, so the overall response from all of these actions is we are going to, first of all, increase our water retention, also increase water intake, which then is going to increase our blood pressure. Increasing sodium reabsorption doesn't necessarily directly increase our blood pressure, but what it does is it helps to maintain our osmolarity as we reabsorb water and take in new water. It's also going to increase our like if we don't take in enough water, it's going to increase our osmolarity, which is going to make us thirsty, which then is going to make us take in more water. And then as a result of that, that is going to increase our blood volume, which is going to increase our blood pressure.